VMWARE Fault Tolerance. So in this module we'll cover some details on vSphere fault tolerance, and then I'll go to my vSphere web client and show you guys how we can enable this. This would be a short module, so let's get started with this. Okay, so whilst HA would eliminate downtime due to a host failure by restarting the VM on another host, the fault tolerance feature of vSphere, it provides a higher level of protection for a VM, and it does this by protecting it from a host failure with zero downtime and zero data loss by creating a second copy of that VM on a different host. So the VMware vLockstep technology, this would ensure that the two copies of the VM that are on two separate hosts, it would ensure that these two copies are in sync and the primary VM is in the active state. So this is the VM that will be running your application and that will be serving your user requests. Okay. From the end user perspective, there's only one virtual machine. Okay. So basically, it's whatever you have on your first copy of the virtual machine, and that would be on the second copy too. So if your VM gets corrupted, your guest OS, something goes bad there after an update, for example, that would also happen on your second copy too. Ideally, you would want to use the fault tolerance feature for your mission critical VMs, where downtime just cannot be tolerated. The fault tolerance feature could also be used in places where, or in place where situations would dictate that you have some sort of third-party application for a failover cluster. So once we have FT deployed, we want to ensure too that we have our host monitoring turned on also. This is due to the fact that if the host monitoring is turned off and we have a failure in the primary VM, our secondary VM would take over and a new secondary VM would not be created. Thus, if we were to have another failure, we wouldn't have any redundancy there. Redundancy, or the fact that we wouldn't be able to tolerate a second host failure. Okay, so fault tolerance in vSphere 6.0. As compared to vSphere 5.5 and previous versions, 6.0 could support virtual machines with up to 4 vCPU. Before vSphere 6, we could have created VMs with only 1 vCPU. And this was a problem. Since our mission critical VM that we wanted to use the fault tolerance feature on would have needed more than 1 vCPU. Okay. For memory, as compared with vSphere 5.5, fault tolerance in vSphere 6 also supports 64 gigs of RAM, or VMs with 64 gigs of RAM. With 5.5 and lower editions, we could have implemented fault tolerance only on VM with the thick eager 0 disk provisioning. With vSphere 6, we can now implement fault tolerance with thin, thick eager 0 or thick lazy 0 provisioning for our VM disks. New also in vSphere 6.0 is protection from data store failures. With vSphere 5.5 and lower, we could have only protected a VM from a host failure. New in 6 is the fact that the secondary VM, it is completely separate, or it's a complete separate VM with its own VMX file, VMDK file. So protecting our VM from a data store failure would basically equate to 0 downtime now in 6.0. Also, vSphere 6.0 have a 10 gig network requirement for fault tolerance. Um, so if we don't have this don't necessarily need to be a dedicated interface. So we could have a 10 gig interface and share that bandwidth with a network I/O control, and we could basically give our fault tolerant part of that higher priority on that 10 gig link. Okay, so let me just pull up my vSphere web client here, and we'll have a look where we can configure this. So so to start with, as I mentioned, we would need 10 gig connection. My infrastructure here don't have a 10 gig network, but what I'll do is show you guys where we could start the implementation of this. So on both of our hosts that we'll implement this between, we will need to go to our network, manage our VM kernel adapter, and if you go to add network in here, let's just go to add a VM kernel network adapter. Say we are setting it on that same vSwitch 0. So let's just give this a name FT. Here we have the option for fault tolerance login. Okay, so we could enable fault tolerance login here. You'll want to manually set your IP address too. And then you'd want to do this on your other hosts too. Okay, and what we could also do is just edit one of our existing VM kernel port here and just add or enable a fault tolerance login on that. Okay, so our management port here, for example, we could enable that traffic. Okay, but ideally you'd want to set up a separate VM kernel port here, and then on the other end, on your other host, you would do that too. Once this is completed, we could go to the VM that we are trying to enable this on, fault tolerant. So let's say this CentOS here we are trying to set up fault tolerance on. We'll just right click this VM and go to fault tolerance, and then just turn on fault tolerance here. Okay, so I don't have sufficient bandwidth to enable this. As I mentioned, I don't have 10 gig network in here, and that's the warning I'm having here. It may allow me to proceed from here. Okay, and then you'll just select a data store to place a secondary VM disk and configuration file. Then you select the host, and that should be it. Once you finish there, this VM should be protected with fault tolerance feature.